Hey all, what's up? It's Amanda and I'm back with another video. So today's video is going to be my May wrap up. I have a ton of books to share with y'all because I read so many books this month and a lot of them were on my physical TBR, so that is just like so good. I'm like so proud of myself that I read a ton of books off my physical TBR. But anyways, let's get right on into the video. Y'all, so we are gonna go over first my statistics on Storygraph. I know I have my pile of books here. I forgot to film my statistics first, so whatever. We are doing statistics first and then we're gonna get into this pile of books. So in the month of May, I read 9 books and it totaled to 3,317 pages, and it says 0 hours, but you know the drill. I read audiobooks in tandem with the physical books for like every single book that I can. So that is kind of inaccurate. I am so proud of myself. I read over 100 pages every day of this month. Not like consistently every day. There were some days that I read like 50 pages. Some days I read like 250 pages. You know what I mean? So it all just evened out to about 115 pages-ish per day, which is something that I've never done before. I normally read about 75 pages per day, like the average equals out to 75 pages per day, which is about like, it's between 2,000 and 2,500 pages per month. Anyways, back to the statistics. My top moods were dark, reflective, mysterious, and tense, and emotional. I'll add that in there. Those are like the biggest chunks. And adventurous, honestly, because that is a pretty big chunk too. So top 6 right there. Pace, 11% of the books that I read were slow paced, which equals out to just 1 book. And then the rest of the books I read, which equals out to 8 books, or 89% of the books I read, were medium paced. For page number, I'm very proud of this because I feel like I don't normally read a ton of long books, long as in over 300 pages, but this month it was pretty good if you ask me. The first chunk, which was less than 300 pages, I read 44%, or 4 books. The next chunk, which is 300 to 499 pages, was 44%, or 4 books. And then I read 1 book that was 500 plus pages, which was, as you can see, that big chonker right there. Audiobook length is inaccurate because I read like all of these books with an audiobook. Fiction / nonfiction is a little disappointing. I didn't read any nonfiction this month, so 100% of the books I read were fiction. My top genres, this is interesting, were horror as my #1 genre, LGBTQIA, and fantasy. And then the rest are all just like tied for 2 or 1. But those were like top 3. For tags, I just use this to keep track of how many owned books I read versus library books. I read 1 library book and 8 of my owned books, or my physical TBR. Format, again, this is a little inaccurate because I read the print books with the audiobooks in general for like most or all of the books that I read. This does say that I read 3,208 pages. And lastly, my star ratings. I have 9 reviews and my average for the month was 3.83. I had mostly 4.25 stars. If we're getting technical, you know, some of them were 4.25 stars. My highest rated book was 4.5 stars. I didn't have any 5 stars this month, but I'm okay with that. I had a ton of 4 stars. And then my lowest rated book was 3 stars, which I had 2 books that I rated 3 stars. So not a bad month. I really enjoyed all the books that I read this month, even though some of them were kind of average, kind of middling books. So the first book that I finished this month was Mary, An Awakening of Terror by Nat Cassidy. This book was so good. It was so creepy and eerie and weird, and I just loved this book. I think it was such a well done book. I gave it, I believe, 4 stars on Goodreads. Yeah, so I rated this a 4 stars on Goodreads. I loved it. I highly recommend if you are interested in horror This is a really good book. This follows our main character, Mary, who is like essentially, she's 49 years old and she's going through perimenopause, and she's experiencing really weird symptoms. And every time she goes to the doctor, they're like, it's just menopause. And she's like, is it though? And at the very beginning of this book, her aunt calls her, who is like, her aunt is like her only living relative that she is in contact with or something like that. And her aunt calls her and is like, I need you to come take care of me. I'm very sick. And the same day that her aunt calls, she loses her job. So Mary's kind of like, well, if you're going to pay me to come help you, then of course I'll come help you. And so Mary goes to her aunt's, and her aunt lives in this really small town with like a population of like 100 people or something like that. And it's very weird, the vibes of the town, because there's this like looming mansion that's looking over the town, and Mary's like drawn to it, and a lot of weird things start happening. I love this so much. I highly recommend that you read this, and I am looking forward to reading more from Nat Cassidy. I know that they have another book that just came out recently called Nestlings, and I really want to pick that up. So that was Mary. The next book that I read is a chonker of a book. This is A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. So this book is like the 4th or the 5th in the series. If you count the novella, it is the 5th book in the series. If you don't count the novella, then it's the 4th book in the series. But that's neither here nor there. This book is following a different character than who we were following previously. And then that's all I'm going to say, because it does reveal, if I were to go into the plot, it does reveal a lot about like what is happening in the world, as it is the 5th book in the series. So I'll just say that I really enjoyed this. I gave this like a 4.5, 4.25 stars, if I'm being super specific. I wasn't really connecting with the main character all that much in the beginning, but by the end I was loving the main character's perspective. I was so happy with her character growth and all that jazz. So if you are interested in Sarah J. Maas and like ACOTAR, I highly recommend that you read the series, as this is the last book that is currently out in the series. Next, I read my TBR jar pick, which was, if you can see that, These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. Put that there. This book was so good. I don't know if I mentioned in that video of my May TBR my relationship with this book, but essentially I started reading this book like 2 years ago, in the very beginning of the year, 2 years ago in 2022. And it took me 9 months to get to page 200 something. And I was like, you know what, maybe I should just DNF this book. So I DNF'd it. But then I was really sad that I DNF'd it, so I put it back on my TBR. I never unhauled it or anything like that, but I just kind of kept it. And I'm so glad I did, because this book was such a pleasant surprise. This book is following our two main characters, Roma and Juliet. The setting is, what year is it? 1926 Shanghai. So it's set in the 20s. There's no modern technology. Roma and Juliet are part of rival gangs, and there is this like epidemic plaguing like Shanghai. And so they kind of band together and team up to figure out what is the cause of it and what, like, why it's happening, like who is behind this, all that stuff. It ended on a cliffhanger, and I was not prepared for that. And it was funny because some of the events in the end, I was thinking like, wow, this thing that happens in Romeo and Juliet, the original, has not happened yet. And then it happened like a page later, and I was like, I shouldn't have thought, like, I just jinxed myself, I feel like. But it was really good, and I'm excited to get into the sequel, which is Our Violent Ends. Okay. The next book that I read is called Lilith. It's by Nikki Marmory. This is a book that I actually had seen on NetGalley, and I requested the ARC and I was denied. So I finally picked it up. It came out last October, so not too long of a turnaround. I feel like that's generally how long it takes me to read a new release, unless it's like highly, highly, highly anticipated by me. Anyways, this book is following the story of the first woman who was expelled from paradise. So it basically is, the tagline is, before Eve, there was Lilith. So it's taking the creation story and kind of changing it a bit to say that Eve wasn't the first woman, but Lilith was. And so it's a very interesting concept. This is based on like an old Jewish tale. I feel like that is correct. A Hebrew myth. It's based on a Hebrew myth. And it talks about women's subjugation and subordination to men, and why that is, and how that came to be, and how wrong that is, because Lilith is of the mind that like women are equal to men. So it's a very like feminist story. I enjoyed it, but ultimately there was like a couple parts that I didn't enjoy. So overall I gave this a 3-star. I believe, like, I'm just looking down at my review. There was a section of this book where there was a section of this book where Lilith was teaching like other women about her teachings, and essentially somebody asked like, so if man lies with woman, can woman lie with woman, or something like that? And she was like, of course. And that was like the only mention of queer people in the whole book. That was it. And I was like, if you're gonna bring it up, like, delve into it. Don't just like bring it up so offhandedly just to like have that representation in there when you're not gonna like fully flesh it out. So that kind of bothered me. And I just felt like the messaging was very heavy-handed, which, like, of course, I enjoyed it ultimately. I gave it 3 stars, but it wasn't like anything extraordinary. You know what I mean? This section of the wrap-up, including Lilith, is like where my average books lie. The next 2 books that I read were short story collections, and they were both kind of average for me. The first one that I finished was Salt Slow by Julia Armfield. This one I enjoyed a little more than the other short story collection that I read. There were like a couple standouts. I wrote in the table of contents which were standouts. So the titular story, Salt Slow, which was the last story in the book, was like nearly a 5-star for me. It was so good. There were other ones like The Collectibles and Formerly Feral that were really outstanding. They were like 4 stars, but the rest were kind of just 3 stars. So ultimately I rounded up on Goodreads to a 4, but it was kind of like a 3.5. I enjoyed this. If you liked Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, this has the same like vibes to it, same lyrical writing, but it obviously, like, it's a collection of short stories, so it's different. This next one is a translated book that I read this month, and this is Bizoar and Other Unsettling Stories by Guadalupe Nettle, translated by Suzanne Jill Levine. It's a short little book. I was very excited for this, and ultimately it kind of disappointed me a little bit. I gave this a 3 stars on Goodreads because, like, all of the average of my ratings came out to exactly a 3-star. There were only 2 stories that were standouts for me. It was Through Shades, which was a 4-star, and Petals, which was also a 4-star. I was expecting more unsettling feelings from this, but it didn't really give me that. Only the two that I mentioned were super unsettling. I don't know if the reason why I didn't connect with these stories as much was like due to the translation or whatever. I'm not 100% sure, but ultimately I'm glad I read it, and I'm glad it's off my TBR and on my red shelf. The next book I finished is How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. This was my third Grady Hendrix, I believe, and I'm just realizing that Grady Hendrix is such an amazing writer and storyteller, but unfortunately I don't think that he is like a 5-star all-time favorite storyteller for me, if that makes sense. Like, I have yet to give him a 5-star, is what I'm saying. This was a 4-star. Still really good. I really enjoyed this book. This book follows our two main characters, Louise and what is her brother's name? Mark. So Louise and Mark, essentially, they're siblings, as I mentioned previously, and they're grown adults. They're like in their 30s, and they have a tumultuous relationship. And one day, Mark calls Louise and is like, Mom and Dad are dead. They got into a car accident. They're dead. And so it spirals after that. Louise comes back home and starts to take care of like the estate and like putting their bodies to rest and whatever. And Mark is only concerned about the wills and like who inherits what. And then creepy stuff starts happening. This is a horror book. And it has creepy puppets, creepy dolls, stuff like that. So I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really creepy and gross and just eerie. But it didn't give me that 5-star feeling. I think what it had to say about grief and trauma and sibling dynamics, family relationships, everything like that was really, really well done. But yeah, it just didn't give me that 5-star feeling. And there were times when I was like, this book is wild. It's very campy. I was telling this to my boyfriend. I was like, it's very campy. And he was like, it sounds like you're really liking it. And I'm like, I am, but also I'm like grossed out by it because it's like really creepy and gross. I don't know. If that entices you, I highly recommend this one. Next is a book that I'm kind of disappointed by. I had this as like a 5-star prediction in my mind. I've never made a 5-star prediction video, but in my mind I was like, this is a book that I'm gonna give 5 stars. Ultimately I didn't give it 5 stars. I gave it like a 3.75. This is Chlorine by Jade Song. This book is like so hyped, and that's why I thought I would give it 5 stars. It's basically following this girl, Ren Yu, who she's like 17 or 18 in the story. She's a swimmer and she thinks that she's a mermaid. And she goes through this transformation throughout the story, and that's all I can really say without spoiling anything. It's a horror. And let me tell you, it was horrific. Okay? It was horrific. Nobody talks about it, but like it was horrifying, the events that happened in this book. There's a lot to do with like sexual assault, so trigger warnings for that. Also a little bit of grooming, trigger warnings for that. As well as like intergenerational trauma and like being the child of immigrants, stuff like that. I really enjoyed it, don't get me wrong. I was just expecting this to be a 5-star. I rated this 4 stars on Goodreads. Like I said, it's more like a 3.75, but that's neither here nor there. I still recommend that you read this if you're into like weird girl horror. And lastly, I read Yerba Buena by Nina LaCour. This is Nina LaCour's debut adult novel, and this follows Sarah and Emily. Sarah essentially lives in California, or like Sarah grew up in California in like a very hidden town up north, and from just my understanding of the book. And then something traumatic happens in her childhood, or like she was 17, so like her teenagehood, I guess. And so she runs away to Los Angeles, where she ends up. Emily lives in that area, in the LA area, and she's trying to figure out her life. She's trying to figure out what she wants to do. She's changed her major in college like 5 or 6 times, and each time she was like 3 credits away or 1 class away from graduating with that major, and until she like switched her major again. So they both come together and they form this like really interesting relationship. I really enjoyed this. I gave this a 4-star. I'm looking down at my phone just to make sure that I was correct, that I gave this a 4-star. This was such a moving, heartbreaking, like, look at trauma. It also, excuse me, this also touches on like predators, I guess, of children, and drug abuse, drug use, stuff like that. So it is a very heavy book, don't get me wrong. It's a very heavy book. But I just love gritty books like this, like gritty literary books like this. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel down below. I would love to have you. Please follow me on social media. I always link my Instagram, Threads, TikTok, Storygraph, and Goodreads, so follow me or friend me on any of those. I also always have my Everand link in the description down below in case you want to get like a free trial of Everand, which is like ebooks and audiobooks. I think it's really worth it, and it gives me like a free month as well if you use the link in my description. Just being transparent with that. Also, I'll have my Pango listed in the description. I'm selling a couple books on there, and I'm thinking of selling more books because I'm thinking of unhauling more books, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. If you made it this far, comment the ghost emoji because I read a ton of horror books this month, so just spooky vibes, spooky, ooky, kooky vibes. And yeah, I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.